Ellis Hargrave stood frozen at the entrance of his once proud empire, a towering glass building that bore his name etched in silver letters. Flashes of cameras illuminated the night like lightning, blinding him as reporters shouted questions that pierced the air like bullets. His heart pounded as security guards escorted him out, the doors slamming shut behind him, a sound that marked the end of a chapter in his life. "How does it feel to lose everything, Mr. Hargrave?" a journalist barked. Ellis said nothing. His throat felt dry, his mind blank, as though the weight of the moment had stolen his ability to speak. He tugged at his collar, suddenly suffocated by the expensive suit that now felt like a mockery of who he was. He scanned the crowd, searching for a familiar face, a friend, an ally, anyone who might extend a hand of support. But they were gone, all of them. Hours later, Ellis found himself sitting alone in his empty mansion. The grandeur of his surroundings felt like a cruel joke. Chandeliers sparkled above, their light reflecting off the polished marble floors. But all Ellis could see was the echo of betrayal. His CFO, the man he had trusted like a brother, had been the architect of his downfall, selling company secrets to Nathaniel Burke in exchange for a seat on the rival board. Ellis reached for the decanter of whiskey on the counter, pouring himself a glass with trembling hands. His reflection in the crystal surface stared back, a broken man wearing the mask of a once powerful leader. He sipped the amber liquid, hoping it would dull the ache in his chest, but it only fueled the storm brewing inside him. The silence was broken by the soft chime of his phone. He glanced at the screen, expecting another barrage of hateful messages from former colleagues or strangers online. Instead, it was a voicemail from his mother. His breath hitched as he pressed play. "Ellis," her voice began, cold and sharp. "I warned you. Greed never leads to anything good. You've embarrassed this family enough. Don't contact us again." Her words were daggers, cutting through the thin veneer of control he had left. Ellis hurled the phone across the room, the crash echoing like thunder. Tears brimmed in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Not yet. He walked to the window, staring out at the San Francisco skyline, the city lights twinkling like stars. Once they had represented possibility, ambition, and triumph. Now they felt distant and mocking, a reminder of everything he had built and lost. "What am I without it all?" he whispered into the empty room, his voice trembling. The memories came rushing back, signing his first deal, the late nights building his company from scratch, the champagne toasts with people who had promised loyalty but disappeared when the foundations crumbled. He thought of the people who had depended on him, whose livelihoods were now as uncertain as his own. Ellis's knees buckled and he sank to the floor. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry. Each tear felt like a release, an admission of his failure, his vulnerability. But beneath the despair, a tiny ember of anger burned, a spark of defiance against the forces that had brought him to this moment. The hours dragged on, and the shadows grew longer. Ellis stood, his legs shaky but resolute. He opened his closet, gazing at the rows of tailored suits and polished shoes that had once defined him. None of it mattered anymore. Slowly, deliberately, he packed a single bag, leaving everything else behind. His hand lingered on the doorframe as he stepped out into the cool night air. The mansion loomed behind him, silent and still, as Ellis walked toward the unknown. He didn't know where he was going or what lay ahead, but for the first time he understood he couldn't rebuild his life while clinging to the ruins of the past. Somewhere in the city, a new path awaited him, a chance to rediscover who he was beneath the trappings of wealth. As the city lights shimmered in the distance, Ellis whispered to himself, "This isn't the end. Not yet." Ellis Hargrave tightened his grip on the strap of his worn duffel bag as he stepped into the unfamiliar heart of the Tenderloin district. The faint glow of streetlights barely cut through the gloom, casting long, jagged shadows across the crumbling sidewalks. He pulled his jacket tighter against the cold air, but the chill that crept up his spine came from something deeper: fear, vulnerability, and the stark reality that this was his life now. A man shuffled past him, muttering incoherently, his eyes glazed and distant. Ellis averted his gaze, afraid to meet the stranger's hollow stare. The world felt hostile, unwelcoming, and he realized with a sinking feeling that no amount of preparation could have readied him for this. The bustling boardrooms, the sharp suits, and the power he once wielded were distant memories, useless here. A sudden shout broke the uneasy silence. "Hey, you got something for me?" A figure emerged from the shadows, his clothes tattered, his posture aggressive. Ellis instinctively took a step back, clutching the bag closer to his chest. "Just passing through," Ellis muttered, his voice shaking. The man's eyes locked onto Ellis's bag, narrowing with suspicion. "Passing through? You don't belong here." Before Ellis could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Leave him alone, Vince." A tall man stepped into view, his presence commanding yet oddly calm. His gray hair was matted and his coat was patched and frayed, but his eyes were sharp, piercing even. Vince spat on the ground and backed away, muttering curses under his breath as he disappeared into the night. Ellis turned to the stranger, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. "You're new," the man said simply, studying Ellis with an expression that was neither welcoming nor threatening. "What's your name?" "Ellis," he replied hesitantly. "And you are?" "Dorian," the man said. "Welcome to the Tenderloin. It's not much, but it's home. For some of us, anyway." Ellis nodded, unsure what to say. Dorian motioned for him to follow, and though his instincts screamed to keep moving, something in Dorian's steady gaze made him stay. They walked in silence, weaving through alleys where makeshift tents lined the walls like forgotten remnants of lives once lived. The smell of damp cardboard and rotting food clung to the air, and Ellis's stomach churned. Dorian finally stopped in front of a cluster of tents surrounding a small fire. A handful of people huddled close, their faces worn and eyes wary. "This is where you start," Dorian said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Out here, no one cares who you were. You survive by what you do now." Ellis hesitated, the weight of Dorian's words settling in his chest. He was no longer Ellis Hargrave, the celebrated tech entrepreneur. He was just Ellis, a man with nothing left to his name. As he sat down near the fire, the others eyed him cautiously. Dorian handed him a tin cup filled with something steaming. Ellis sipped it, grimacing at the bitter taste. But the warmth was a small comfort in the biting cold. "Why are you here?" Dorian asked, breaking the silence. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried a quiet demand for honesty. Ellis stared into the flames, the flickering light reflecting in his tired eyes. "I lost everything," he said finally. "My company, my reputation, everything. I thought maybe out here I could find something real, something that matters." Dorian nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You'll learn fast, Ellis. Out here, it's not about what you lost. It's about what you can live without." The words struck Ellis like a blow. He glanced around at the faces surrounding him, each etched with stories of survival, and realized that this was his reality now. The weight of it was suffocating, but for the first time in days he felt something else too, a glimmer of determination. As the fire crackled and the shadows danced around them, Ellis silently vowed to adapt. This was not the life he had imagined, but it was the life he had to live, and he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Ellis's footsteps felt heavier with each step as he wandered aimlessly through the streets. The city pulsed around him, a mix of people rushing to their destinations and others, like him, lingering on the fringes of purpose. His stomach growled, a sharp reminder of how long it had been since his last meal. He tugged his coat tighter, his eyes scanning for any place that might offer a reprieve from the biting hunger. That's when he saw it. A small diner tucked between two aging brick buildings, its neon sign flickering faintly. Harper's Diner. The windows were fogged, but through the streaks, he could make out a warm glow inside. The sight of people eating, talking, and smiling was a cruel contrast to his own state, but something about it drew him closer. The bell above the door jingled softly as Ellis stepped inside. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon wrapped around him like a long-lost comfort. His gaze darted to a corner booth where a young mother was cutting pancakes for her toddler. Across the room, two older men shared a quiet laugh over steaming bowls of soup. For a moment, it felt like he had stepped into a different world, one that hadn't rejected him. "Can I help you?" A firm voice interrupted his thoughts. Ellis turned to see a woman standing behind the counter. Her apron was smudged and her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail. Her expression was guarded, but her eyes held a spark of curiosity. This had to be Harper Winslow. Ellis stammered, suddenly aware of his disheveled appearance. "I was just passing through." Harper studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. She'd seen people like him before, many times. Some genuinely needed help, while others were just looking for a quick handout or an easy mark. She couldn't afford to make the wrong call again. "We're not a shelter," she said evenly. "If you want food, it's $5 for the daily special." Ellis's heart sank. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills and loose coins. He counted quickly, barely $2. Shame prickled at his skin. He nodded and turned to leave. "Wait," Harper called, her voice softer now. "You don't have $5, do you?" Ellis hesitated, then shook his head. "I'll find somewhere else." "Hold on." Harper let out a small sigh, glancing around the diner. Most of the regulars weren't paying attention. They were used to her moments of generosity. She grabbed a plate from the pass-through window, loaded with eggs, toast, and a side of fruit. "Sit down, eat, but next time come prepared." Ellis blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Don't thank me yet," Harper replied, setting the plate down on a corner table. "Just eat and go." He slid into the seat, the warmth of the plate radiating through his cold hands. The first bite was almost too much. His throat tightened as he chewed, the simple act of eating suddenly overwhelming. He looked up and caught Harper watching him from the counter. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps. The bell jingled again, and a man in a sharp suit entered, his cologne preceding him. "Harper," he boomed, "got my usual ready?" Harper's demeanor shifted instantly. "Donaldson," she said, her tone colder, "it'll be out in a minute." Donaldson glanced around the diner, his gaze landing on Ellis. He wrinkled his nose as though offended by his very presence. "New charity case, Harper?" he sneered. Harper bristled but kept her voice steady. "He's a customer just like you." "Hardly," Donaldson scoffed. He turned to Ellis. "Don't get too comfortable. People like you never last." Ellis lowered his gaze, gripping the fork tightly. Harper stepped closer, her voice sharp. "Donaldson, if you've got a problem, take it outside." The man smirked but said nothing, retreating to his usual seat. Harper exhaled, her hands tightening on the counter. She glanced back at Ellis, who was still staring at his plate. "Don't listen to him," she said quietly. "Just eat." Ellis nodded, but his appetite had waned. As he took another bite, he couldn't shake the feeling that this place, this small diner with its flickering neon sign and guarded owner, might hold something he hadn't expected, a chance to feel human again. Ellis had started to find a strange rhythm in his visits to Harper's diner. The warm meals, the buzz of conversations, and the occasional kindness from Harper provided him a sliver of normalcy in an otherwise fractured world. Yet every time he walked through the door, he couldn't ignore the stares, the sideways glances from other patrons. He wasn't one of them, and they knew it. On this particular morning, Ellis took his usual seat near the corner window. The sunlight streamed through the glass, casting a glow on the cracked vinyl seats. Harper moved briskly behind the counter, pouring coffee and jotting down orders, her face a mask of determination. Despite her busy demeanor, she always seemed to keep an eye on Ellis, as if watching for something unspoken. The door jingled and Donaldson strutted in, his presence instantly changing the atmosphere. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he carried an air of entitlement that seemed to command the room. He scanned the diner, his lips curling into a smirk when his eyes landed on Ellis. "Still here, huh?" Donaldson said loudly, drawing the attention of other diners. "I thought this place was a diner, not a charity." Ellis's jaw tightened, his grip on the coffee cup trembling slightly. He didn't look up, but the heat of humiliation burned in his cheeks. The diner grew quiet, the buzz of conversations fading into an uneasy silence. Harper approached the counter, her expression sharp. "Donaldson," she said, her voice steady but firm. You come here for food, not to make comments about my customers." Donaldson leaned against the counter, unfazed. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Look at him." He gestured toward Ellis. "He doesn't belong here. You keep letting people like him in, and it's only a matter of time before your business goes under." "That's enough," Harper snapped, her voice cutting through the tension. "Ellis is a customer just like you. If you don't like it, there's the door." Donaldson's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, straightening his tie. "You're bold, Harper, I'll give you that. But boldness doesn't pay the bills. People like him," he pointed again at Ellis, "will ruin you." Ellis finally looked up, his eyes meeting Donaldson's. "I don't need your pity," he said, his voice low but steady. "And I certainly don't need your judgment." The room remained silent as Donaldson scoffed and turned away, settling into his usual booth. Harper's hands were trembling slightly as she placed a cup of coffee in front of him, her jaw set tight. When she returned to the counter, Ellis glanced up at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Yes, I did," Harper replied, meeting his gaze. "People like him think they can bully anyone they see as weaker. I don't tolerate that here." Ellis nodded, his throat tightening with unexpected emotion. No one had stood up for him like that in a long time. It wasn't just kindness, it was respect, something he hadn't realized he'd been craving. As the diner settled back into its usual hum of activity, Harper placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of Ellis. She didn't say anything, but the gesture spoke volumes. Ellis felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks. Gratitude, not just for the food, but for the unspoken understanding between them. That afternoon, as Ellis left the diner, he caught a glimpse of Harper wiping down tables, her face unreadable but her movements purposeful. He hesitated, then stepped out into the bustling street. For the first time since stepping into this new life, he felt the faintest hint of hope, a fragile, flickering light he wasn't ready to let go of just yet. The hum of the city at night was a strange comfort to Ellis, as he sat on a cracked bench near the edge of a park. The world seemed quieter now, the buzz of Harper's diner fading into the background of his thoughts. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small notebook he had carried for years. Its pages were worn, corners dog-eared from countless late nights of scribbled ideas and plans. Now, it was a relic of a life that felt worlds away. Ellis flipped to a blank page, gripping the pen tightly. He had promised himself he wouldn't write anything down, promised to let go of the man he once was, but tonight felt different. The shadows of the park seemed to press in on him, their silence heavy, as though they carried the weight of his past. Before he could put pen to paper, a voice broke the stillness. "That's quite the notebook for a guy who doesn't look like he's got much else." Ellis looked up sharply. A man in his mid-30s stood a few feet away, his clothes ragged but his posture confident. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've seen you around," the man continued, his voice casual but laced with an edge. "You're new, aren't you?" Ellis closed the notebook slowly, slipping it back into his pocket. "Just passing through." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Nobody's just passing through here. Name's Carter, by the way." He took a step closer, his smile widening. "And I know who you are." Ellis froze. His mind raced, his pulse quickening. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, come on," Carter said, his tone turning sharp. "Ellis Hargrave, you think people like me don't read the news? You were all over it a few weeks ago. Big shot millionaire, right? Or should I say, used to be?" Ellis's breath caught in his throat. He had taken every precaution to blend in, to disappear, but Carter's words were a reminder that no secret stayed hidden forever. "What do you want?" Ellis asked, his voice low. Carter shrugged, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Nothing yet, but a guy like you, you've got connections, resources. Out here, that means something. So, let's just say, I'm keeping an eye on you." Before Ellis could respond, Carter turned and melted back into the shadows, his laughter echoing faintly. Ellis's hands clenched into fists, the sense of security he had started to build crumbling in an instant. The world felt smaller, more suffocating, as the weight of his past pressed against him like a storm cloud. The next morning, Ellis returned to the diner earlier than usual. The bell jingled as he stepped inside, and Harper glanced up from the counter, her brow furrowing slightly. "You're here early." "Yeah," Ellis said, his voice clipped. He took a seat at his usual table, his gaze darting nervously toward the window. He couldn't shake the feeling that Carter was watching. Harper poured him a cup of coffee, setting it down with a soft thud. "You okay?" she asked, her tone softer now. Ellis hesitated, then shook his head. "Just bad memories." Harper studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We all have those," she said quietly. "But they don't define us, not unless we let them." Her words lingered in the air as Ellis stared into the steaming cup. He wanted to believe her, to take comfort in her quiet strength, but the shadows of his past felt too close, too real. As the day wore on, Ellis kept to himself, his mind replaying Carter's words like a broken record. That night, he returned to the park, his eyes scanning the shadows. He didn't see Carter, but the unease remained, settling deep in his chest. Ellis sat on the bench, pulling out his notebook once more. He flipped through the pages, each one a reminder of who he used to be. His hand hovered over the blank page, and for the first time in weeks, he began to write. The words came slowly at first, but as the pen moved across the paper, Ellis felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. He couldn't outrun his past, but maybe, just maybe, he could face it. The rain drummed steadily against the diner's windows, blurring the city outside into a swirl of lights and shadows. Harper moved through the nearly empty space with a practiced efficiency, her footsteps muffled against the worn linoleum floor. Ellis sat at his usual corner table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. "You've been quiet today," Harper said, breaking the silence as she wiped the counter. Her voice was calm, but there was a flicker of something else. Concern, maybe curiosity. Ellis glanced up, his expression guarded. "Just thinking." She set down the rag and leaned against the counter, folding her arms. "That can be dangerous." He allowed himself a small, humorless smile. "Yeah, it usually is." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the clatter of rain and the occasional hum of passing traffic. Harper's gaze softened as she watched him, the lines of worry etched into his face more pronounced in the dim light. "You're not the only one carrying a past, you know," Harper said finally, her voice quieter now. Ellis looked up, surprised by the shift in her tone. There was something raw in her expression, something unguarded that he hadn't seen before. "You don't have to tell me," he said cautiously. "Not if you don't want to." She hesitated, her fingers drumming lightly against the counter. Then with a deep breath she began. "I was married once," she said, her voice steady but tinged with an undercurrent of pain. "His name was Mark. On the outside, he was everything you'd want in a partner. Charming, successful, the kind of guy who could light up a room." She paused, her jaw tightening. But behind closed doors, he was a different person. Ellis felt his chest tighten, but he didn't interrupt. He could see the effort it took for her to continue, the weight of her memories pressing down on her. "The first time it happened, I told myself it was a mistake," Harper said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "That he was just stressed, that it wouldn't happen again. But it did, over and over, and every time I found another excuse to stay." Ellis clenched his fists beneath the table, anger bubbling in his chest, not at her, but at the man who had hurt her. "What made you leave?" he asked softly. She hesitated, her eyes glistening. "I didn't," she admitted. "Not at first. I stayed until I found out I was pregnant." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she quickly looked away, blinking back tears. "I thought maybe a child would change things, that he'd finally see what he was doing, that he'd change for the better." Ellis swallowed hard, his heart aching for her. "But he didn't," Harper continued, her voice breaking. "One night he came home drunk, angrier than usual. I tried to keep calm, to avoid setting him off, but he shoved me. I fell and..." She stopped, her hand pressing against her stomach instinctively. "I lost her, my baby girl." The silence that followed was deafening. Harper wiped at her eyes quickly as if embarrassed by her tears. That was the night I finally left. I packed a bag, walked out the door, and never looked back. Starting over wasn't easy, but I knew staying would have killed me. Ellis didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate in the face of her pain. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand hovering hesitantly before resting gently on hers. She didn't pull away. "You're stronger than you think," Ellis said quietly. "Stronger than most people I've met." Harper let out a shaky breath, a faint, bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. "Some days I don't feel strong," she admitted. "But this diner, it gave me a purpose, a way to move forward." Ellis nodded, his admiration for her growing with every word. "It's more than a diner," he said. "It's a refuge. For people like me, for people who need a second chance." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his. "And what about you, Ellis? What's your second chance?" He didn't answer right away. The rain had eased to a gentle patter, the world outside still and quiet. "I don't know," he admitted finally, "but maybe I'll find it here." For the first time, Harper didn't just see a man lost in the shadows of his past. She saw a flicker of hope, a reflection of her own journey to rebuild from the ashes. And in that moment, a fragile understanding passed between them, unspoken but deeply felt. The diner was unusually busy that afternoon, the hum of voices and the clatter of dishes filling the small space. Ellis sat at his usual corner table, his notebook open but untouched. His thoughts were clouded, weighed down by Carter's ominous warning and the ever-present threat of his past catching up to him. Harper moved through the room like a steady current, her smile polite but distant, as if guarding herself against the weight of her own memories. "Smile, sis," Chloe's voice cut through the noise as she appeared in the doorway, phone in hand. Her carefree energy contrasted sharply with Harper's focused demeanor. Chloe weaved through the tables, waving at customers as though she were the diner's star attraction. "Chloe, what are you doing here?" Harper asked, her tone tinged with exasperation as she set down a pot of coffee. "Just visiting my favorite sister," Chloe said with a grin. She pointed her phone toward Harper, the screen blinking red. "Say hi to my followers." Harper's expression darkened as she reached out, lowering Chloe's arm. "Not here, not now." "Relax," Chloe said, rolling her eyes. "It's just a quick video. You're always so serious." Ellis watched the exchange, sensing the tension but staying silent. He had learned to read Harper's moods over the weeks, and today her usual composure seemed to be fraying. Chloe, undeterred, scanned the diner and spotted Ellis. Her eyes lit up with curiosity, and before Harper could stop her, she approached his table. "You're Ellis, right?" she asked, her voice bright but sharp. "I've seen you around. What's your story?" Ellis tensed, his grip on the notebook tightening. "Just a customer," he said curtly, avoiding her gaze. "Come on," Chloe pressed, leaning closer. "Everyone's got a story, and you seem like the kind of guy with a good one." "Chloe, enough," Harper said firmly, stepping between them. "Leave him alone." Chloe raised her hands in mock surrender, a mischievous grin on her face. Fine, don't get your apron in a twist." As Harper ushered Chloe back toward the counter, Ellis exhaled slowly, his nerves rattled. He glanced at Chloe's phone, its camera still pointed in his direction. A chill ran down his spine. That night, in the quiet of her small apartment, Chloe uploaded the video she had taken, a short clip of Harper at the diner with Ellis briefly visible in the background. To Chloe, it was harmless, just a snippet of her sister's daily life. But to someone else, it was a beacon. The next morning, Ellis arrived at the diner earlier than usual. The tension in his chest had grown overnight, an uneasy sense of foreboding he couldn't shake. As he stepped inside, Harper greeted him with a small nod, but her focus was elsewhere, her brow furrowed as she read something on her phone. "Everything okay?" Ellis asked, his voice tentative. Harper looked up, her eyes flashing with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Do you know about this?" she asked, holding up her phone. On the screen was Chloe's video, now gaining traction online. Ellis's stomach dropped. "I had no idea," he said quickly. "She filmed that without me knowing." Harper sighed, running a hand through her hair. "This is the last thing I need. People are already asking questions about the diner, and now this? Who knows what kind of attention it'll bring? Before Ellis could respond, the door opened with a sharp jingle, and a man stepped inside. His face was unfamiliar, but the calculating look in his eyes sent a jolt of recognition through Ellis. It wasn't Carter, but it was someone who knew him, someone who had seen the video. The man approached, his steps slow and deliberate. "Ellis Hargrave," he said, his voice low and cold. "I've been looking for you." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, silencing the diner. Harper turned to Ellis, her expression a mix of shock and betrayal. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is that your name?" Ellis looked at her, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The shadows of his past had finally caught up to him. Ellis stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. The man who had just walked in was not a stranger. He was a reminder of everything Ellis had tried to escape. The man's eyes were cold, assessing, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Ellis Hargrave," the man repeated, his voice almost a growl. "I've been looking for you." The tension in the diner was palpable. The few patrons that remained in the small, cozy space exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the shift in the air. Harper was still behind the counter, her hands frozen in place, her face pale as she watched the exchange. Ellis swallowed hard. His mind raced. This man, he knew who Ellis was, what he had been, and most damning of all, how he had fallen. "Who are you?" Ellis asked, his voice barely above a whisper, a mix of dread and curiosity. The man smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was something far more unsettling. "I'm someone who's been watching you, and I know all about the little game you're playing, hiding out in a diner, pretending to be someone else." Ellis's blood ran cold. He wanted to lash out, to scream at the man for coming into his life like this, but he held back. He wasn't sure if this was the moment where his past fully caught up with him, or if it was just another step in the long, painful march back into the world he had lost. "Why now?" Ellis asked. "What do you want from me?" The man stepped closer, his eyes locked onto Ellis with a cruel intensity. "I want you to know that there's no escaping what's coming. Nathaniel doesn't forgive, and neither do I." Ellis's breath caught. Nathaniel. The name rang in his ears like a bell tolling the death of his last hope. He thought he had left that world behind, thought he could disappear, blend in, live quietly. But the past had claws, and it always found a way to pull you back in. "I'm not the man I was," Ellis said, trying to find his voice. He stood up, his legs unsteady, the weight of this moment settling like a stone in his chest. "You don't know what I've been through." "Oh, I know exactly what you've been through," the man sneered. "You think you can run away from it all? From the lies, the betrayal, the wreckage you caused? It doesn't work like that. People don't forget." He leaned in closer, his breath warm on Ellis's face. "You can't hide forever." Ellis took a step back, his heart racing. There was nothing he could do to change the past, no way to erase the decisions that had led him here. But that didn't mean he had to accept this man's judgment. "I'm not running anymore," Ellis said, his voice steadying. "I may not be who I was, but I'm not going back to that. Not for anyone, not for you, and certainly not for Nathaniel." The man's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment Ellis thought he might strike him. But instead the man straightened up, his lips curling into a smile that was far more sinister than anything Ellis had seen. "Fine," the man said, his voice cold as ice. "But don't think you're done. You'll find out soon enough. The past never stays buried." Ellis's fists clenched at his sides, the man's words echoing in his mind. It wasn't over, not yet. He had hoped foolishly that he could leave it all behind. But now, standing in the diner surrounded by strangers who didn't know him, the weight of the truth slammed into him harder than any of Nathaniel's attacks ever had. The man turned and walked toward the door, casting one final glance over his shoulder. "We'll be seeing each other again," he said, his tone a threat wrapped in a promise. "And when we do, there'll be no hiding." Ellis watched him leave, his hands trembling. He felt a cold sweat form on his brow, but he didn't move. Not yet. Harper was standing at the counter, her face pale but unreadable. She hadn't said a word during the confrontation, but Ellis could feel the weight of her gaze. She knew. She had to know who this man was, what he represented. Ellis took a deep breath and turned toward her, his voice strained. "I'm sorry. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want to bring this to you." Harper's eyes softened, but she didn't approach him right away. She just nodded slowly, her lips pressing together as though she was trying to make sense of the storm that had just passed through. "Don't apologize," she said quietly. "We all have ghosts, but you don't have to face them alone. Not anymore." Ellis closed his eyes for a brief moment, grateful for her words, but the dread lingered, heavy in his chest. He wasn't sure if he could outrun his past, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't face it alone. Ellis sat at the corner of the diner, his hands gripping the edges of his mug like a lifeline. The weight of the conversation with the man who had come to threaten him still lingered in his mind, like a bad taste that wouldn't go away. He hadn't expected his past to find him so soon, not like this, but now that it had, he couldn't escape it. Harper hadn't said much after the man left. She'd been unusually quiet, her focus turned inward as if processing the moment, the chaos that had erupted. Ellis couldn't blame her. He was still trying to make sense of it himself. He had come to San Francisco to disappear, to rebuild. But now, the ghosts he'd run from were back in full force, pulling him deeper into the mire of his past. "Ellis?" Harper's voice cut through the fog of his thoughts. He looked up to see her standing at the counter, her eyes fixed on him. There was something in her gaze, something that made his stomach twist. "I need to ask you something," she said softly, the weariness in her voice unmistakable. "Is it true? Are you really Ellis Hargrave, the man from the news?" Ellis's breath caught in his throat. The question hung in the air like a knife, sharp and undeniable. He had known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. The truth had always been a heavy thing, and now it was out there between them. He nodded slowly, the words hard to get out. "Yes, I am. Or I was." Harper didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for something, some answer, some justification. Ellis felt his heart pounding in his chest, the anxiety of the moment choking him. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with hurt. Ellis's hands shook slightly as he placed the coffee cup back on the table. "I didn't want to be that man anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I could just disappear, if I could start over, I could leave everything behind, my past, the lies, the people who wanted to tear me down. I thought maybe I could find something real here, maybe even redemption." Harper's gaze softened, but the hurt was still there just beneath the surface. "And now?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Do you still think you can outrun your past?" Ellis looked at her, feeling the weight of her question like a punch to the gut. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe that he could find a way to move forward, that his past didn't have to define him. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I thought I could, but maybe I can't." Harper sighed and walked over to him, her expression unreadable. She set a plate of food down in front of him, something she had clearly prepared for herself. "You can't keep running forever, Ellis," she said quietly, sitting across from him. "You can't hide from what you've done or from who you were, but that doesn't mean you're stuck." The words sank deep into him. The truth had been uncovered, but it wasn't just the truth about who he was. It was the truth about who he could be. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness. As Ellis looked up, he saw something else in Harper's eyes, something softer. She had given him a chance, despite the weight of his past, despite everything that had happened. She didn't know how deep his mistakes ran, but she was still here. She was still listening. "I don't deserve this," he murmured, feeling the shame rise within him. Harper met his gaze, her voice steady and calm. "No one's perfect, Ellis, and you don't have to do this alone, but you have to face the truth, the real truth." Ellis nodded, a quiet resolve beginning to form inside him. The past had found him again, but maybe this time it wouldn't break him. Maybe this time he could confront it head-on and find a way to rebuild something from the wreckage. He stood up slowly, his hands no longer trembling but steady. "Thank you," he said softly. his voice full of gratitude. "For not giving up on me." Harper didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. "It's not about giving up," she said quietly. "It's about figuring out what comes next." And for the first time in weeks, Ellis wasn't sure if he had the answers. But he knew one thing. He was no longer running from the truth. Chloe stood outside the diner, the weight of the phone call still heavy in her hands. The screen had gone dark, but the conversation she'd just had with the reporter was etched into her mind, replaying over and over again. She had tried to ignore the call, but when the reporter mentioned Nathaniel's name, she couldn't stop herself. She had already crossed a line, but now it felt as though the entire world was collapsing around her. She took a deep breath and walked into the diner, trying to shake off the guilt that clung to her. She had only wanted to help her sister. She thought if she could bring in more customers, show people the real Harper, it might give her some kind of recognition, something more than just a small-town diner. But now, with the video circulating online, things had gone too far. Harper was at the counter, her face set in a mask of controlled tension as she spoke to a customer. When she saw Chloe enter, she didn't smile. It wasn't the usual greeting Chloe was used to. No teasing, no playfulness, just a tight-lipped silence. Chloe hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. "Harper," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harper didn't look up at first. The tension between them was thick, a weight neither of them seemed ready to acknowledge. Finally, Harper put down the coffee pot and faced her sister. Her expression softened, but the hurt was clear in her eyes. "You've really done it now, haven't you?" Chloe flinched at the words. She hadn't realized how much damage a single video could do. I didn't mean for it to go this far," Chloe stammered. "It was just supposed to be harmless. I thought it would help the business and you." Harper's eyes narrowed, her lips trembling. "You thought it would help me? By exposing us like that? By putting Ellis on display like a circus act for the world to see?" Chloe took a step back, the weight of her sister's words crashing over her. She had tried to play it off, thinking it was just another video. But now, seeing the pain in Harper's eyes, the truth hit her. She had crossed a line. She had hurt Harper, the one person who had always been there for her, the one person who would always protect her, and she had done it for views. "I was stupid," Chloe said quietly, her voice cracking. She glanced at Ellis, who was sitting in the far corner, his head down. The shame washed over her as she saw the hurt in his expression too. He was already dealing with enough, and now this? She had betrayed him as well. Harper's face softened just a fraction. "You weren't thinking, but it's not too late to fix this." Chloe swallowed hard, trying to control the tears that threatened to spill. How? How can I fix it? I've already ruined everything." Harper took a deep breath, her tone softening. "You start by owning up to what you did. You tell the truth. To Nathaniel. To everyone. Make it right." Chloe nodded slowly, a new resolve hardening inside her. She had made a mess of things, but she wasn't going to let it destroy everything. Not her relationship with Harper, not the diner, and not Ellis, who had become more than just a stranger in the past few weeks. "I'll do it," Chloe said, her voice stronger now. "I'll go to the press and I'll make sure they know the truth. I'll set it right." Harper didn't say anything at first. Instead, she reached across the counter, pulling her sister into an embrace. It was brief, but in that moment, Chloe could feel the weight of her sister's forgiveness, even if it was still tentative. "Thank you," Harper whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I need you to be here, to stand with me, with us." Chloe nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of regret and determination. She had made a mistake, but she wouldn't let it define her. She would take responsibility for her actions, make amends, and do what she could to help fix the damage she had caused. As the moment passed, Ellis stood up from his table and slowly walked over to them. His eyes were tired, but there was a small glimmer of hope there, a quiet understanding between him and Chloe. He didn't speak at first, but when he did, his voice was calm. "Thank you," he said simply, "for doing the right thing." Chloe met his gaze, and for the first time since all of this had started, she felt a sense of peace. She had betrayed them both, but now she could make it right. The diner was busier than usual, but the usual hum of morning chatter felt distant to Ellis. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the looming storm. Nathaniel, the man whose betrayal had started this whole spiral, was now only a few steps away from finishing what he'd started. Ellis knew it. Harper knew it. The threat was real, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed everything. The door swung open with a familiar chime, and Ellis's breath hitched. He turned just as Nathaniel stepped inside, flanked by two men in dark suits. His presence was as cold and commanding as it had always been. The moment he entered, the energy in the room shifted, like a cloud settling over a bright sky. Harper, who had been moving between tables, froze mid-step. Chloe, standing near the counter, stiffened as her eyes met Nathaniel's, but she said nothing. Ellis stood from his seat, meeting Nathaniel's gaze. For a moment, the two men locked eyes. The past, all the things Ellis had tried to escape, flooded back. Betrayal, guilt, and rage. But this time, he wasn't afraid. This time, he would face it head-on. Nathaniel's smile was cold, almost predatory. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice smooth but sharp. "If it isn't the prodigal son. And I see you've made some new friends, Ellis." His gaze slid over to Harper and Chloe with a dismissive flick of his eyes. "I would have thought you'd have better taste." Harper stepped forward, her voice steady, but there was no mistaking the fire behind her words. "What do you want, Nathaniel?" Nathaniel raised an eyebrow at her, then turned his attention back to Ellis. "I think you know what I want. You've been hiding, running away from your mistakes, but it's time to pay up. Time to give back what you took." His gaze hardened, like a predator zeroing in on its prey. "And I'm not here to negotiate." Ellis clenched his fists, trying to control the rage bubbling inside him. He had nothing left to lose. Not his money, not his name, but he had this moment, this stand. The man who had once controlled everything, who had ruined him, was standing here trying to take the last bit of dignity he had left. And Ellis wasn't about to let that happen. "You don't get to control me anymore, Nathaniel," Ellis said, his voice low but unwavering. "Not now. Not ever again." The room was silent for a heartbeat. Nathaniel's eyes flickered with surprise, then amusement. "You really think you can stop me?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. Ellis didn't flinch. "I'm not alone this time." Harper moved to Ellis's side, her stance strong, her eyes fierce. Chloe followed suit, standing tall, her shoulders squared. "You won't do this," Harper said, her voice unwavering. "You've already taken everything from him, but you will not take this place from us. We've built something here and you can't destroy it." Nathaniel sneered. "You think you can stand up to me? You really think you're a match for everything I've built?" Ellis stepped forward, closing the gap between them. "I don't need to be a match for you, Nathaniel. All I need is the truth." The men flanking Nathaniel shifted uneasily, and Ellis noticed a subtle shift in Nathaniel's expression. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, especially not by someone he saw as beneath him. But Ellis wasn't the man he used to be, and neither was Harper or Chloe. "There's no escape for you," Nathaniel hissed, his teeth clenched. "This ends now." Ellis took a deep breath, his chest rising with resolve. "It's already ended, Nathaniel," he said. "It ended the moment I stopped running from you." Without another word, Nathaniel turned on his heel, the two men with him following closely. As they exited the diner, the air seemed to lift, the weight lifting from Ellis's shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of relief. The diner was quiet, save for the faint clinking of cups and silverware. Harper and Chloe exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. Then Harper met Ellis's eyes, her expression softening. "You did it," she said, her voice quieter now. "You stood your ground." Ellis nodded, the tension in his body slowly unwinding. He wasn't free from his past. He knew that. But for the first time, he felt like he could face it. And maybe, just maybe, he could finally begin to rebuild. Not just his life, but the trust that had been shattered along the way. Chloe stepped forward, her eyes glistening. "We did it," she corrected softly. "Together." Ellis looked at both of them, gratitude flooding through him. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I wouldn't have made it through this without you." Harper smiled faintly, a sense of peace settling over her. "We're in this together, Ellis, and we'll face whatever comes next. Together." The days after Nathaniel's departure were filled with a quiet tension, a calm that felt fragile, like the air before a storm. Ellis had hoped that things would return to normal, but the weight of the past still lingered. He could see it in Harper's eyes, the unspoken worry that still hung between them, the fear that Nathaniel wasn't done with them. But for now, they had peace, a fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. The diner, though, was thriving. It had become a refuge for more than just Ellis. People who had been lost, who had nowhere else to turn, now came through the doors, seeking comfort, community, and a safe space. Harper had created something beautiful out of the wreckage of her past, but Ellis knew it wasn't without sacrifice. That afternoon, as the last of the lunch rush trickled out, Ellis lingered behind the counter, watching Harper work. Her movements were fluid, practiced, but there was something more behind them, a weariness that didn't come from the long hours, but from something deeper. He had seen it before, the toll that fighting for something worth saving took on someone. Harper had fought for this place, for the people who had come to trust her, and now it seemed like she was giving everything to keep it alive. He walked over to her, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Harper, you don't have to do this alone." Harper didn't look up at him immediately. She set down the coffee pot, her fingers lingering on the handle. When she finally met his gaze, there was a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes that she rarely showed. "I'm not alone," she said softly. "Not anymore." Ellis took a step closer, his voice quiet but firm. "But you're still carrying it all. This place, the diner, your past. You don't have to carry it by yourself." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, Ellis saw a glimpse of the woman beneath the walls she had built. The woman who had endured so much, who had fought and sacrificed to survive. But there was more to her than that. More than just strength. There was a kindness, a generosity of spirit that had drawn him in from the moment they'd met. She wasn't just a survivor, she was someone who wanted to heal, to build something better. "I have you," Harper said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have you and I have this place. But sometimes it feels like it's not enough, like I'm always giving but there's nothing left for me." Ellis felt a pang of guilt at her words. He had seen how much she had given, how much she had poured into this place, into people, into him. But he also saw the emptiness in her eyes, the exhaustion that was wearing her down. "You've given everything, Harper," Ellis said, stepping closer. "But you need to take something back. You need to take care of yourself too." She looked up at him, her expression softening, but there was something else in her gaze, a hesitation, as if she were afraid of something, afraid of what it would mean to let someone in completely. "I don't know how," she said, her voice small. "I don't know how to stop giving. I don't know how to let someone else carry the weight." Ellis's heart ached for her. He understood that kind of fear, of losing yourself in giving, of not knowing where you end and the world begins. But he also knew the power of love, of shared burdens. "Let me help," he said, his voice steady. "Let me help carry some of that weight, not just for the diner, but for you. We can do this together, Harper." For the first time in what felt like forever, Harper smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Together," she repeated, as if the word itself was a lifeline. Ellis stepped forward, taking her hand in his. There were no grand promises, no perfect solutions, but there was a quiet understanding between them now, a recognition that they didn't have to face the challenges of the future alone. They had each other. Harper squeezed his hand gently, a silent thank you in the gesture. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice steady now, "but I know one thing. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Ellis nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. This was it, the beginning of something new, something real. And though the road ahead would still be difficult, full of uncertainties and challenges, he knew they would face it together, side by side. And for the first time in a long while, he felt hope, not just for himself, but for them, for the future they would build. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting long beams of light across the worn wooden tables. The usual clink of silverware and the hum of quiet conversation filled the air, but there was something different today, something alive, something new. The once fledgling diner had transformed in ways none of them could have imagined. The community had come together, and the diner had become a sanctuary, a place where people could feel safe, heard, and valued. It was more than just a business now. It was the heartbeat of the neighborhood. And it wasn't just Harper who had breathed life back into it. It was everyone. Ellis sat near the window, watching as the steady stream of customers filtered in. He had never thought he would find peace here, but now, surrounded by the hum of laughter, the clinking of cups, and the comforting scent of freshly baked bread, he realized he was finally home. Not the home he had once built with money and ambition, but a home rooted in something far more meaningful: connection. Harper walked by, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, her apron slightly askew, but there was a new kind of lightness in her step. She stopped by Ellis's table, smiling down at him. "How's the coffee today?" she asked, her voice teasing. Ellis smiled back, but there was more to his gaze than just amusement. "It's perfect," he said simply. "Just like this place." Harper's smile softened. She was different now. She had always been strong, but now she carried a quiet strength that radiated from her, like the anchor that held this entire place together. The scars of her past still lingered, but they didn't define her anymore. She had rebuilt herself brick by brick, just like the diner itself. "I couldn't have done it without you," Harper said, pulling up a chair and sitting down next to him. "Without all of you." Ellis shook his head. "We all did it together." A few tables over, Chloe was talking animatedly to a group of regulars. She had become the lifeblood of the diner's community events, organizing everything from weekly potlucks to local talent nights. There was no sign of the guilt that had weighed so heavily on her before. She had found her redemption in action, by giving back and showing up for the people who mattered most. "Chloe's really found her place here, hasn't she?" Ellis remarked, his eyes following her as she waved goodbye to her latest group of friends. Harper nodded. "She has. We all have." Her voice was filled with pride, the kind of pride that came from watching people grow, watching them rise from their mistakes and choose a better path. "It wasn't easy, but we got through it. We rebuilt ourselves, and we built something that matters." Ellis's gaze softened. He had been running from his past for so long, and now, standing in the heart of the community they had forged together, he understood the true power of connection. He wasn't just healing himself, he was part of something bigger, something far more profound than he had ever realized. As Harper moved to check on another table, Ellis's thoughts turned inward. He thought of the man who had walked into the diner months ago, the man who had tried to tear it all down. Nathaniel's shadow still loomed, but the truth was, it was no longer the threat it once was. Harper and the people in this room had proven that. They had built something stronger than fear, something that could weather any storm. Ellis took a deep breath, his chest swelling with the weight of his realization. He had lost so much, but in the process, he had gained something far more valuable: a community that cared, a place where love wasn't just an abstract idea. It was lived, shared, and nurtured every single day. The door jingled, and a new group of faces walked in. Familiar faces, those who had found their way to the diner for the first time, hoping for something more. And they would find it. They would find hope, connection, and a new family, just like Ellis had, just like Harper had. As Ellis stood to leave, he caught Harper's eye across the room. She gave him a small, knowing smile. It was a smile that spoke of shared triumph, of battles fought and won, of the kind of love that required sacrifice but rewarded tenfold. And in that moment, Ellis realized that he wasn't just a visitor in this community. He was home. With one final glance, he walked out into the sunshine, a new chapter ahead of him, surrounded by the people who had become his family. And as the door shut softly behind him, he knew he was no longer running. He had found his place, his peace, and his purpose. Ellis stood at the edge of the diner, looking out into the quiet street as the late afternoon sun bathed the world in soft golden light. The air had cooled, But the sense of possibility was still warm, lingering in the back of his mind. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had brought him to this moment. There had been so much pain, so many mistakes, his fall from grace, the betrayal, the endless running. But now, here, in the heart of the community he had helped rebuild, he realized he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Harper stepped out beside him, her presence as steady and comforting as it had always been. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there with him, sharing the silence. They didn't need words to understand that everything had changed for both of them. "It feels different," Ellis said finally, his voice low. Harper looked at him, her gaze thoughtful. "Everything feels different when you stop running," she replied, her voice soft but sure. Ellis smiled a little, a quiet, genuine smile. "I don't think I've ever stopped running. Not really." "Until now," Harper said, her voice tinged with a warmth that made Ellis's heart stir. They both turned to watch as the last few customers left the diner, some of them pausing to wave goodbye, others laughing over small jokes. It was a simple scene, but it held a deeper meaning now. The diner wasn't just a place for food. It had become a gathering place for those who needed a home, a place of support, a place to belong. And Ellis, in his quiet way, had become a part of that community. Chloe walked out from inside, her face bright with a spark of energy. She was laughing, chatting with one of the regulars before she caught sight of Ellis and Harper standing together. Her smile softened when she saw them, and she quickly joined them at the door. "You two seem like you're in a good place," Chloe said, her tone light but sincere. Ellis chuckled. "You could say that." Harper nodded, her gaze shifting between them. "We've all been through a lot, but we're here, together, and that's enough." Ellis met her gaze, his heart swelling with gratitude. She had been his anchor, the one person who had believed in him when he could hardly believe in himself. And now, standing here with Chloe beside them, he realized they had all changed. They had all healed, in their own ways, and found something worth fighting for. "We've rebuilt this," Ellis said, his voice gaining strength. "But it's not just about the diner. It's about us, about what we've built together, what we've found in each other. We've all made sacrifices, but we've done it for something real." Chloe's expression softened. "Yeah, and maybe that's the real gift, you know? Not just the place, but the people we're becoming. We're not running anymore. We're here." Ellis looked at her, feeling the weight of those words. "We're here," he echoed. For a moment, they stood there together in the quiet of the evening, the city's soft hum in the distance. It was a peaceful moment, one that held a promise of things to come. Ellis wasn't sure what the future held. There were still challenges ahead, still shadows of the past that might return, but he knew now that he didn't have to face them alone. He had Harper, Chloe, and this community, and for the first time in years, he felt a deep sense of belonging, of purpose. The door to the diner opened again, and one of the regulars came out with a grin on his face. "Don't forget about us now," he called playfully. Ellis laughed, the sound coming easier than it ever had before. "Never," he said, turning back to Harper and Chloe. "I think I finally found where I belong." Harper smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We've all found it." And as Ellis stood there, surrounded by the people who had become his family, he realized that he wasn't just looking ahead to an uncertain future anymore. He was looking ahead to a future that was full of possibilities, full of love, sacrifice, and redemption. What do you think of Ellis's journey from a millionaire to a man seeking redemption? Share your thoughts in the comments below. From 0 to 10, what's your score for this emotional story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And remember, check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.